Hello everybody. Today we're going to be learning how to use fronted subordination to form complex sentences in our writing. For this lesson you'll need a pen or a pencil and your exercise book or some paper. Pause the video if you need to go and get anything now. Okay, so last week we learnt about main and subordinate clauses to create complex sentences. Pause the video and remind yourself all about main and subordinate clauses. So, hopefully, you have remembered that a main clause is a group of words that contain a verb and a subject which make complete sense on its own. Main clauses could also be called simple sentences. A subordinate clause is a group of words that is dependent on the main clause because it does not make sense on its own. When main clauses and subordinate clauses are used together to form a sentence, that's called a complex sentence. Okay, so now we've recapped on main and subordinate clauses, have a look at this complex sentence on your screen. James gasped for breath before setting off again. Can you identify the main and the subordinate clauses here? Pause the video and make your decision. You could also have a go at the star challenge to keep the main clause but change the subordinate clause. Off you go and start the video again when you're ready. How did you do? Hopefully you identified the main clause as James gasped for breath, as that makes complete sense on its own and has a subject, James, and a verb, gasped. Therefore, the subordinate clause is before setting off again. Before is the subordinating conjunction, and this clause must be attached to the main clause in order for it to make sense. Well done if you were able to do the star challenge and change the subordinate clause. I thought about changing it to as he climbed the steepest part of the mountain. So my new complex sentence would be James gasped for breath as he climbed the steepest part of the mountain. What did you come up with? In the sentences we looked at last week, the subordinate clause has always been after the main clause. However, subordinate clauses don't always have to be after the main clause, and in fact we can start a sentence with the subordinate clause. This is called fronted subordination. It is as simple as swapping around the main and subordinate clauses. However, when we use a subordinate clause at the beginning of a sentence, we must add a comma before the main clause. Let's use the example of James gasped for breath before setting off again. On the screen, you can see that the red writing is the main clause and the purple is the subordinate clause. Can you see when I have swapped the clauses round, I have put a comma to separate them? Now that the subordinate clause is starting the sentence, it's really important that the capital letter changes too. We know that we must always start a sentence with a capital letter. If you'd like to stretch your brain a bit further, have a look at the star challenge. You can also embed a subordinate clause within your main clause. Look at my example. James, before setting off, gasps for breath. Can you see that I've used commas at the start and end of my subordinate clause? This helps me read it and helps it to make sense. If I take out the commas and the subordinate clause, I am left with just the main clause. Perhaps you could pause the video and see if you could embed a subordinate clause into this main clause. So now we've looked at how to switch the clauses around so that the sentence begins with the subordinate clause. Can you have a go? I'd like you to pause the video and rewrite the sentences into your book, but with the subordinate clause at the start of the sentence. Remember, you will need a comma to separate the subordinate clause and the main clause. You might find that it helps you to colour code and underline the different clauses so that you know what you are moving. Ready? Pause the video and off you go. Well done everybody, let's see how you got on. Remember to tick the ones you got correct and correct any others. Look out for any marvellous mistakes. You can see on your screen now that I have shown my main clauses in green and my subordinate clauses in blue. My commas are in red. Remember, for each sentence to be correct, you must have your capital letter at the start of your sentence, your full stop at the end, and the comma to separate your clauses. So, sentence number 1. Even though it was cold outside is my subordinate clause. Then I have my comma. David didn't wear a coat. That's my main clause. Sentence 2. If I ate all of my dinner, subordinate clause, comma, Mum said I could have an ice cream, main clause. Sentence 3. When he got home from school, subordinate clause, comma, Tom did his homework, main clause. Sentence 4. Because the wind was strong, subordinate clause, comma, the windmill sails turned quickly, main clause. Sentence 5. While her brother went to the gym, subordinate clause, comma, Karina swam 50 lengths, main clause. And sentence number 6. As he drank his morning coffee, subordinate clause, comma, Mr. Smith watched the sun rise, main clause. Well done everyone, I'm sure you're working really hard. So now we're confident with main and subordinate clauses and their different positions in a complex sentence, let's check our learning. Have a look at the sentences on your screen now. Can you write them into your books and underline the subordinate clause in each one? Remember to only underline the words that are part of that clause. If you want an extra challenge afterwards, can you try and embed the subordinate clause into the main clause? Pause the video now and have a go. Okay, how did you get on? Remember, the subordinate clause is the part of the sentence that adds extra information to the main clause, but it does not make sense on its own. Remember to tick your answers as we go along and correct any marvellous mistakes you might have made. Sentence number 1. The subordinate clause in this sentence is at the beginning, when she was standing next to her brother. The main clause, Anita looked very tall, makes sense on its own. Sentence 2, again the subordinate clause is at the front of the sentence, even though he had little patience. And then the main clause, Ethan enjoyed chess. That stands alone, that's the main clause. Sentence number 3, the subordinate clause is at the end of this sentence, after they had eaten their dinner. The family went for a walk at the start, makes sense on its own, so is the main clause. Sentence 4, the subordinate clause is at the start of the sentence, if you want to improve. You must practice a lot is your main clause. And lastly, sentence 5, the subordinate clause is at the end of this sentence, so that she could buy a new bike. Jane saved her pocket money, makes sense on its own, it's a main clause. How are you all getting on? Okay, now let's see if you can add your own subordinate clause to these main clauses on your screen. In a second, pause the video and rewrite the sentences in your book as a complex sentence with your own subordinate clause at the start of each sentence. Try to use a variety of subordinating conjunctions. I've put some on the screen to help you. If you'd like an extra challenge, can you embed a subordinate clause into some of those sentences? Okay, ready? Off you go. Play the video again when you're ready. Now, this is a difficult one to mark because you could have come up with a range of subordinate clauses. However, what is important is that you have started each sentence with a subordinating conjunction and remember to put the comma to separate the main and the subordinate clauses. Of course, you must have a capital letter at the start and you must have finished with a full stop. For example, I might write, as his fingers danced elegantly over the keys, the man played a flawless tune on the piano. Is there someone you might be able to check with at home? Well done everyone, we're nearly at the end of the lesson. Today we have talked about the use of a comma in a complex sentence. Remember, if the sentence starts with the subordinate clause, you must have a comma to separate it from the main clause. If the sentence starts with a main clause, you do not need a comma. For our star challenge today, we also learned that you can embed a subordinate clause in the middle of a main clause, and if you do this, you need a pair of commas to separate it from the main clause. With these things in mind, look at the sentences on your screen. I've not put any commas in at all. Can you work out which sentences don't need a comma, which do need a comma, and which might need two? Copy the sentences into your book, adding in the commas in the correct places. Are you ready? Pause the video and off you go. Okay, let's see how you've got on. There were a few tricky ones in there, so don't worry if you've made a marvellous mistake, just correct them in your book. So sentence number 1, the subordinate clause was at the front of that sentence, so you needed a comma after city. So since moving to the city, comma, Hannah had made lots of friends. Sentence number 2, the subordinate clause was in the middle of the main clause, so you needed a pair of commas. So it should read, the children, comma, because it was so warm, comma, wore shorts to school. Sentence number 3, you didn't need any commas there because the subordinate clause was at the end of the sentence began with the main clause. Sentence 4, the subordinate clause here is at the beginning of the sentence, so you need a comma after work. After Lucy finished her work, comma, she played in the garden. And lastly, number 5, again, I used an embedded subordinate clause, so this is a star challenge. The car wouldn't start is the main clause. The subordinate clause is as it hadn't been driven for weeks, so I need a pair of commas. So the sentence should read, the car, comma, as it hadn't been driven for weeks, comma, wouldn't start. How did you get on with that? Okay, to finish our lesson today, we're going to check our learning by looking at the sentences on your screen. I'd like you to decide which of these sentences is written correctly as a complex sentence. How do you know? Why are the others incorrect? Pause the video until you're happy with your explanation. Okay, so the correct complex sentence is sentence number 2. Number 2 is the only correct one as the main and subordinate clause have been separated with a comma. The main clause, Ben ate an ice cream in the garden, makes sense on its own. The subordinate clause, because it was a hot day, is not complete, it is dependent on the main clause. But why are the others incorrect? Lots of people make the marvellous mistake in sentence 1. This is only a subordinate clause. It is incomplete and we need a main clause to know what the sentence is about. What happened as the battle began? Sentence 3 has a main clause and it has a subordinate clause, but the comma is missing and this is vital. This is another marvellous mistake that lots of people make. Sentence 4 is incorrect because they've used a full stop to separate their clauses rather than a comma, so it is not a complex sentence. And sentence 5 is incorrect as it is not a complex sentence. There is no subordinating conjunction and both clauses are main clauses and is a coordinating conjunction. Therefore, this is a compound sentence. How did you get on today? How confident do you feel now with complex sentences? I think you're all probably experts and I look forward to reading them in your writing. Have a good day.